Hey guys, this is Caleb with Second Son Woodworks, and today I'll be building some shelves out of pine plywood, metal piping, and a little bit of blue pine for the edges. Let's get started. As you can see here, I clamped together 3 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood that I picked up at Home Depot. After cutting these pieces down to approximate length, I went ahead and moved them over to my table saw to cut them down to the width of my closet. I also made sure to set aside the scraps from these cuts because the scraps will be used to mount the shelves in the closet. You'll see later in the video. After that, I took each individual piece of plywood and cut it down to the final length. Each piece will be a different length because I wanted to have the shelves staggered, and likewise there was a corner that I had to cut out in order to have it fit into the closet. Since the closet bar would be anchored to the top shelf, I went ahead and used the bar itself to measure out the overall length the top shelf would need to be for the final cut. The measurements for the shelves can vary depending upon the size of your closet, so just make sure you take some good measurements. Then I took those scrap pieces of plywood and cut them down to the length of the shelves. Then after that, I took some scrap pieces of blue pine that I had left over from another project, and I planed them down so that they'd be nice and smooth. After that, I cleaned up my shop and then started packing everything into my guest room for the install. Once I got all the materials into the house, I went ahead and removed the old shelving unit. Then I took the first shelf and flipped it over upside down to install the first floor flange. The majority of the floor flanges that I used were black, but they ran out of the black 3/4 inch flanges at the store, so I had to buy a few of the stainless steel ones. I installed these on the bottom side so that nobody could see them. From there, I flipped the shelf over after I installed the second floor flange, flipped the shelf over, and then I leveled out the shelf, and while I was holding it at a level spot, I drew some lines underneath the plywood to mark out where I would be hanging the scrap pieces of plywood that the shelf would actually sit on. I made sure to check the level of these pieces of plywood to make sure that the shelf would be sitting nice and flat back into that space. Then I attached the bottom floor flange to the floor and then drilled out a couple pocket holes on the back side of the shelf to screw the shelf to the support beams that are underneath. And then I went ahead and moved on to the next shelf, and I pretty much just did the same thing, but I kind of had to drill over the top of some screws that were popping out from the previous flange, and you'll see later that I have to caulk in the kind of void between the flange and the shelf. And I just kept moving up the shelves. The first two are the same length, as you can see, and then the third one is going to be kind of staggered to the back, and then the top one will be the same length as the two on the bottom. And the reason I did that is because I had 3 long pieces of the plywood in the shop, and then I had just 1 extra scrap piece that would work as kind of the back set shelf. When I went to install the second shelf, I quickly realized that the screws were going to be coming right through the top, and there wasn't going to be an additional floor flange that I could use to cover it up like I did in the previous shelf or on the previous shelf. And I didn't have any other screws in my shop that were shorter, so I tried to chop them off, as you can see, but that didn't really work out. And I didn't want to go to the hardware store, so what I went ahead and did is use a piece of pine that I had left over to kind of cover it up. I cut the piece of pine down, you'll see here in a second, and then I attached it to the top and kind of in order to hide the screws that are popping out. And then I will caulk around this later in the project and then paint it over. So. One thing I will mention is that during the process I didn't screw the supporting plywood beams to the studs in the wall because I did enough screws that I figured that it would hold it with the pipe. If you do want to do it into the studs, I would recommend getting a stud finder. When I went to install the bar that would serve as the hanger for your clothes in the closet, I had to smash some cuts of the pine plywood or pine that I had left over in order to make a surface that the flange could attach to. You can do this in a different way if you'd like and make it a little bit more clean, but I was a little bit in a rush, and so I went ahead and just decided to do it this way, and then I'll paint it and caulk it after. After finishing the build, I went ahead and started caulking everything. Since I'll be painting the entire plywood surface white, I went ahead and did as much caulking as I could so that it all looked nice and smooth. As you can tell, this caulking took a lot of time, but I wanted to make sure that everything was nice and smooth before I went ahead and did the prime and paint. And that way the shells will look nice. You can do this differently if you'd like, but I figured why not fill in all the holes. After finishing the caulking, I went ahead and grabbed my house vacuum, did a little cleanup, and then I laid down an old curtain to do the initial painting. I used Kills 2, a water-based Kills primer, to do the first layer of paint. After finishing the first coat of primer, I went ahead and taped off the floor flanges and started to do the regular coat of paint. After finishing the painting, I went ahead and took some leftover blue pine, about 3/4 inch thick, that I had left over from some slabs that I used in another project, and I used these pieces to edge out the pine plywood. After cutting down the pieces of blue pine to the length of each of the shelves with a mitered outer corner, I used my finish nailer to attach them to the plywood. Once I finished attaching each of the pieces of blue pine, I tapped in the nails so that they would be flush with the wood, and then I used some wood putty to fill in their holes. And then after that, I oiled up the wood with some linseed oil. After oiling down the blue pine, the project is complete, and I'm really excited about how this turned out.